Welcome back to Economics 231. This is the video lecture for Chapter 26, Part 2. Again, there's an Apply assignment. Make sure you get that done on MindTap. That counts as the video quiz. This is not a quiz. There are no questions. This is just video lecture. Now, previously we talked about what happens when there is a surplus or a shortage of money on the market. That this will result in a change in interest rates. Okay. Now, what can the Fed or a central bank, how can they influence the equilibrium interest rate? Okay. They can increase or decrease the supply of money, and they do that through creating bank reserves. Okay. If the Fed wants to increase the supply of money, they will buy bonds from the banks, and the banks will then have bank reserves, which they can multiply on top of by 1 over the reserve requirement ratio, which is currently 0. So they can infinitely multiply on top of that money currently. If they want to decrease the money supply, they buy bonds back from the banks. Okay? They sell the bonds to the bank pays in bank reserves, the Fed destroys those reserves. And when they do that, that reduces the excess reserves or reserves in the banking system. And if the bank is fully lent out, they would then have to reduce the supply of money, checking account balances, by calling in loans to their customers. Okay? So that's how the Fed increases and decreases the supply of money. You'll remember this from chapters 24, 25, and what has government done to our money on the last exam. So if they want to increase in the supply of money, if they increase the supply of money, that will create a money surplus, and people will buy bonds. Okay? As this increase in demand for bonds occurs, and people try to buy more bonds with the surplus cash, that will cause a decrease in the interest rate. Okay. So to give you a visual example, here we have a market in equilibrium. There's the money supply before the Fed does anything. Here is the money demand. Where those two intersect, that determines the interest rate, and the supply of money is given. Now, when the Fed wants to increase the supply of money, they will buy bonds from the banks, increasing bank reserves. The banks lend that money out, that increases the supply of money by 1 over the reserve requirement ratio times the amount of money that the Fed pumped in. Okay, at least that's the maximum amount. The banks don't have to fully lend out. But as the banks lend this new money out, that increases the supply of money. People will buy bonds with that surplus of money, and that will cause a movement down the demand curve from E1 to E2. So the supply changes, but in this case, money demand stays the same. We move down from equilibrium 1, where interest rates are 6%. We get a surplus of money that causes people to use that surplus of money that they don't want to hold to buy bonds. And that increases the price of bonds and decreases the interest rates in the economy. If the Fed decreases the supply of money, that will cause a money shortage, and people will sell bonds to get the cash that they want to hold. By doing so, that will cause the prices of the bonds to decrease. You've got more sellers. To get a buyer, those new sellers have to sell the bonds for less on the market, and that causes the interest rate to go up on the bonds. So here we have an initial money supply of that's actually $1.5 trillion. We have money demand, and interest rates are in equilibrium at 4%. The Fed will sell bonds to the banks. The banks pay for those bonds in cash. The Fed, or in bank reserves, the Fed destroys those bank reserves. They go away. And the banks can lend out less money and or have to call in loans. As they call in loans, that creates a shortage of money of $500 billion. People will sell people will sell bonds on the market, causing the bond prices to go down, interest rates on the bonds to go up. So we'll move from E1 to E2. And the new equilibrium here occurs at a higher rate of interest at 6%. Now, in the Keynesian model, what do changes in the money supply affect? They affect interest rates, which in turn affect investment spending, aggregate demand, and real GDP, employment, and prices. Here is an example of how this happens. You get a change in the money supply. We're going to move that box. Okay. That causes a change in interest rates. And we've explained on the prior slides how that happens. That change in interest rates changes investment. So if interest rates go up, investment spending will go down. The Keynesian model believes that spending generates real output. So if we have less investment spending, all other things being equal, that will cause a decrease in aggregate demand. We looked at those in chapters 20 and 21. As aggregate demand decreases, that will cause a decrease in real output, decreases in prices, and an increase in unemployment. Real GDP and unemployment are inversely related. If real GDP goes down, unemployment goes up. If real GDP goes up, we'll see unemployment go down. Okay. Now, real quick, just to give you a quick primer here, the money supply is inversely related to interest rates. Interest rates are inversely related to investment. If interest rates go up, investment spending goes down. Here, ceteris paribus, investment spending is directly related to the aggregate demand curve. So if investment spending goes down, aggregate demand curve goes down. And then generally, aggregate demand is inversely related to prices, real GDP, and directly related to employment. So here we have what the Keynesians would consider expansionary monetary policy on aggregate demand. Here's our money market. Okay, we have an initial quantity of money of $1 trillion. We have an intersection here with the money demand curve, and we have interest rates at 6%. An increase in the quantity of money from MS1 to MS2 causes us to move down this money demand curve because of the surplus of money that now exists. People will take this money, buy bonds with it, increasing the price of the bonds and causing interest rates to fall, bringing us to a new equilibrium here at E2, where interest rates went from 6 down to 4%. The investment demand curve here, I is investment spending at different interest levels, if interest different rates. Businesses, governments will invest, businesses, my fault, will invest different amounts of money. When interest rates are high, investment spending will be low. When interest rates are low, investment spending is high. So we started off at 6%. The rate dropped from 6 to 4. That causes us to move down the I curve here, the investment spending curve. And investment spending increases from $800 to $850 billion a year as interest rates fall. So you see the inverse relationship between interest rates and investment spending. Now, businesses will invest in projects which the expected rate of profit equals or exceeds the interest rate in the Keynesian model. So if interest rates drop, more new business projects, which previously appeared unprofitable at the higher rates, now appear to be profitable because of lower interest rates. And in the Keynesian model, businessmen will now increase investment spending, starting more projects. Okay. So here we have the product market. You'll remember this from chapter 15 on GDP. This is a classical section of the aggregate supply curve, the intermediate section, and then we could have a horizontal section here, but they don't. Okay, so here's our initial equilibrium. Price level is on the y-axis. Real GDP in billions of dollars is on the x-axis. And we have an initial equilibrium. You could think of this as when rates are at 6%, with a price level of 210 and $13 billion in real GDP. As interest rates drop, that causes investment spending to increase, which increases aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. Okay. We move up the aggregate supply curve from E1 to E2. Prices have gone up. The price level's gone up from 210 to 215 in this example. And real GDP increases from 13 to $14 billion. So an increase in the money supply will cause a decrease in interest rates, which will induce more investment spending, so I increases. Aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So if I increases, that will increase aggregate demand, and we shift the curve to the right to increase it. Okay, an increase in aggregate demand will cause generally an increase in prices and an increase in output. Now, a very closely related paradigm in economics is something called monetarism. Okay? Monetarism comes to us from people like Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman. And this is a theory that says that changes in the money supply directly determine changes in prices, real GDP, and output. So instead of it indirectly affecting prices, GDP, and real and employment, changes in the money supply instead of indirectly affecting them through its effect on investment spending in the Keynesian model, monetarism says it directly affects those things, and that is through what we call the monetary policy transmission mechanism. A change in monetary policy causes a change in the money supply. A change in the money supply directly causes a change in that aggregate demand curve. The Keynesians had another arrow here that went to investment spending. So once again, a change in monetary policy causes a change in the money supply. There's a roundabout method to get here for the Keynesians, right? This change in the money supply changes interest rates, which changes investment spending, which then changes aggregate demand. To the monetarists, it's a more direct link. You get the change in the money supply that directly causes a change in aggregate demand, and then causes changes in prices, real GDP, and unemployment. So they cut out a few steps. So the way they use something called the equation of exchange, and it's an accounting identity that states the money supply times the velocity of money equals total spending. So MV equals PQ. M is the money supply. V is the velocity of money. You can think of this as the average number of times a dollar is spent. Okay, so let's say the money supply is $1 trillion, and the velocity of money is 10. You have $1 trillion times 10. Spending would equal 10 trillion. And spending is equal to the prices times quantity. So this would be a series of prices. The price of beef times the number of pounds of beef sold, plus the price of oranges times the number of oranges sold, plus the price of an airplane times the number of Boeing 37 airplanes that are sold, the price of a brand new Ford Mustang times the number of Ford Mustangs sold, plus all of the different little prices in the economy times the quantity of those things sold, and then you add up and sum them. Okay. And again, the velocity of money we talked about, the average number of times per year a dollar of the money supply is spent on final user goods and services. Okay. Okay. The theory, the quantity theory of money, the theory that changes in the money supply are directly related to changes in the price level. Okay. So the conclusion here is any change in the money supply, M, must lead to a proportional change in the price level, P, because classical economists argue that the velocity of money, V, and real output remain constant. Now, the monetarists view criticism of this, okay, is that although velocity is not unchanging, it is predictable. The Fed should increase the money supply at a constant percentage to avoid inflation or recession. So the monetarists believe there is some amount of money that the Fed should create every year that will prevent the economy from going into a recession and not cause excessive price inflation. Okay. Milton Friedman was a leading proponent of this. He was a leader in putting forth the ideas of the modern day monetarist. Okay. Now, Friedman said the Federal Reserve should follow a fixed money target and increase the money supply by a constant percentage each year to enhance full employment and stable prices. Okay. So, Friedman thought that in order to maintain full employment, to keep the economy from going into recession, that you had to have this central bank that followed a rule to some degree, that they could increase the supply of money by a certain percentage each year, have it be constant, fixed, and to some degree known, and that this would prevent the economy from going into a recession or from out of control prices. A lot of what the monetarists believe is that you have to keep prices constant or slightly increasing every year to avoid recession. That recessions are to some degree caused by falling price levels, by what we call price deflation or decreases in the money supply. The Keynesians, on the other hand, believe that the velocity of money is not stable or predictable. Comparisons during the 80s and early 90s and after 2001, velocity was unpredictable, supporting the Keynesians. Between 1946 and 1981 and 1993 and 2000, velocity rose at a predictable or constant rate, supporting the monetarist. And there are other problems that go along with this. We as economists don't even agree on what the actual supply of money is. We have M1, M2, M3, MZM. I'm an Austrian. The Austrians have a completely different supply of money. Depending upon which view you have on what the money supply actually is, also leads to differences in whether or not you believe that the velocity of money is predictable or unpredictable, whether it rises at a constant rate or is unpredictable. So here are a graph here with estimates of the velocity of money. You can see here until we get to around 1981, things don't change very much, but they increase, but at a sort of constant rate. Then haywire breaks out at different periods of time. Now, what we're going to present as the classical view is generally presented in the textbooks as a caricature. No one really believed this stuff. When Keynes wrote his book, we call it the general theory of prices, wages, and unemployment. When he wrote that book in 1943, he presented a caricature of what classical economics believed, and no one believed it. He then used that straw man to attack and defend his theories. Now, the argument goes that the classical economists believe that the economy automatically self-corrects to full employment in the long run because of flexible prices and wages. Therefore, there is no need for fiscal policy. That is not completely true. The Austrian School of Economics, for example, says that there is an optimal supply of money, and that supply of money is the amount that is in existence at that time. Okay? That changes in the money supply affect the economy in adverse ways. And you saw that with Rothbard's book, What Has Government Done to Our Money? Okay? They say that classical economists believed in the quantity theory of money and that increases in the money supply cause inflation. Well, to some degree that is not true. What most classical economists would believe, or what say Austrians would believe, is that increases or decreases in the money supply, say increases in the money supply, cause prices to be higher than they otherwise would have been. The Austrians, for example, would say that price deflation doesn't cause recessions, that changes in the money supply, specifically increases in the money supply that enter into credit markets first, cause distortions in the economy, in this case a boom, and that during the boom, those business projects, we said, that get started solely because of the decrease in interest rates, those are projects that previously appeared unprofitable and for which there were not enough real savings to complete, along with all the other projects in the economy, that those projects get started and that it creates an illusion of increased output and well-being. But but that eventually either the money supply stops increasing and or it becomes apparent that these extra projects started because of the low interest rates were never going to be profitable. They were not going to create wealth, but rather were wealth destructive, and or that there were never enough real savings available to complete all of those projects. Okay. Keynes comes along, and he argues that the economy does not automatically self-correct to full employment in the long run, okay, and that prices and wages are inflexible in the downward direction during a severe recession. Therefore, there is a need, according to Keynes, for a fiscal policy. Keynesian economists believe that the velocity of money is unstable and that changes in the money supply affect interest rates and investment. Okay, and that was where we went the long way around with the Keynesians. Okay. Now, we're going to leave it off here. I saw videos getting to be long enough. Thank you very much.